I want risk taking to be a part of my creative process and a part of the process of the people that I collaborate with as well. I don't want to leave anything on the table, so to speak, or off the table, more like it. I want to be very fulfilled by tapping into new ideas. And one way I've tried to describe it is that even when I sit down to make a game track, I try to feel like what I'm about to make is going to be a new experience for me, something I haven't made before. I don't want to make the same thing twice, whether it be game music or classical music.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. What's up, y'all? Welcome to the show today. If you're new here, glad to have you along. My name is Tyler. I'm a composer, a radio broadcaster, and a podcaster. And in this series, Music Maker, I sit down and talk with composers, but also folks who make other things from time to time, and I talk about their journeys and artistic process. And of course, if you've been listening for some time now, welcome back. Glad to see you again. Today on Music Maker, my guest is composer Joshua Mallard, and I am very, very excited to share this conversation with you. Joshua Mallard is an award-winning composer currently residing in Austin, Texas. Joshua's eclectic body of work seeks to reshape musical idioms and embrace experimentation. His work consists of music for game, film, and classical music. He's worked with companies and studios like Blipsounds, Super Evil Megacrop, Eline Media, Lunchbox Entertainment, and Critcrew, and his music has been performed internationally by a variety of ensembles including HyperCube and Rote, Hund, Muzik. In this conversation, Josh and I dig into all things music and sound design for video games through the lens of the work that he does in that space, but we also talk about how he views himself as a bit of a musical chameleon and how he operates in the very different worlds of both contemporary concert music and game music. This is maybe one of my favorite conversations yet, and I think you're really going to love it. Just a little business here before we hop into this conversation. One of the simplest and actually truly the best way for you to support this podcast is to just keep doing what you're doing now, listening to this episode, listening back to earlier episodes, and then also giving us a follow on your favorite streaming platform. That'll ensure that you get the newest episode as soon as it's released, pushed straight to your device. You can tangibly support what we're doing here and get early access to episodes by becoming a Patreon subscriber for just $5 a month. And yes, that little bit of support goes quite a long way in helping me cover the costs of some of the tools that I use to produce this podcast and really just to boost my morale in a lot of ways. And if an ongoing donation isn't your thing, I've also got a one-time coffee link set up along with that Patreon link on our website. You can find all of that online at looseleaftransmissions.com/support. If you're curious about previous episodes of the podcast, want to revisit some of them or listen to them for the first time, you can find them on your streaming platform, Spotify, Apple Podcast, wherever you're listening to this right now, or just visit looseleaftransmissions.com/music maker. Finally, the single most impactful and also a free way that you can help the Music Maker podcast is to leave a rating and a review if you feel so inclined. It takes just a few minutes, and the more of those that we have, the more visibility the podcast has, and the more that we can grow and just keep doing what we do as we head into the future. All right, now on to my conversation with Joshua Mallard. Well, Josh, I'm really excited to talk to you, and I don't want to embarrass either of us when I say this, but I think you're the first person, I know you're the first person that I'm talking with who I remember you like fresh out of high school. And so it's been really exciting to kind of see your growth as a composer and a musician. And I'm excited to kind of dig into your journey and process a little more today. So thanks for your time.
Oh yeah, glad to join in. And it's a beautiful full circle thing. You remember me from back then. I remember you as well.
Yeah.
And always been a fan of what you do. So hey, I'm glad to be on the other side of it.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. So where I start with all of these is kind of as far back as you can remember and that you're willing to share. And my first question is, what is your earliest artistic memory as a composer?
Yeah, actually, I guess this is where things can get immediately funny. I'd say my first music making experiences were when I was like 13 or 14. I was like a metalhead and I always wanted to scream and sing and stuff. Now, obviously, you know me as a composer, you can imagine how that went, but
Yeah.
I got my first bit of gear and I was actually probably the first thing I was doing was voice memos, just trying to recreate stuff on my phone. And, you know, this sort of urge to make something based off of what I hear was, I think, the first hint of me getting into that composer mentality. Of course, I went through middle school and high school band and stuff, and playing flute in band was always a part of maybe that music making intuition. But I think, even during that time, I was trying to experiment a lot with making just about anything in my room.
Yeah. So you were recording, I guess, kind of rudimentary ideas on voice memos, maybe on your phone or something like that. And then were you pulling them into your computer and working with them that way, or was it just simply, I'm going to record this thing so I can have it for later for something?
Yeah, I guess it started first as like me just trying to like express myself. I would record these voice memos and then eventually I got into Reaper, which I mean, I'm a huge Reaper fan, but I won't talk your ear off as many Reaper users probably do. But that was my first gateway to actually like making music. I would start to do vocal covers and stuff and then I said, "Well, how can I make my own instrumentals?" And so that's when I got into virtual instruments, trying to download drum sets online and orchestral VSTs and stuff, getting into East West and whatnot. And that's when I really just started creating anything. If I was listening to some metal, I try to make it at home. If I was listening to eventually classical music, I was trying to make it in Reaper or in Sibelius with the MIDI playback. So that's really like the root of where that all started. And say I was about like 13 or 14 when that really kicked off.
When was the first time that you made a piece that someone else played? Was that something that you were thinking about? Because I know where our discussion will probably lead later, a lot of the work you do is for these virtual instruments even today, and of course, you also write music for
Mhm.
other people to play. Was that part of your high school experience, or was that a little bit later?
Oh yeah, I'd say I got super lucky at the time. I was in a high school organization, which probably many of you know through NAFME, the Music Honor Society, and the charter at my school. I ended up becoming president of at one point, and then at that point, I started to get some of the people around me and make a little wind ensemble. And that was the very first piece I had performed. I had made sort of this ad hoc wind ensemble
Mm,
and gotten people together. And I had made a lot of just like stuff in Sibelius at that point, and this was really the first time putting it to the test. And from there, I did some other things like a lot of arrangements of like Christmas tunes for my high school ensembles. And we did a thing called Mosaic where it was a bit of like song and dance on stage, music in motion, so to speak. And that's where I did some like Wizard of Oz arrangements, things like that. And those were my first experiences hearing my music live. And I think that was very invaluable. It was interesting to be sort of like, okay, these are being performed for live audiences at the concerts. And it was very different than working, in a DAW making things,
right.
as the
Yeah.
painstaking process of making it digitally.
Yeah. Well, even just having the clarity of like a living human being playing your music. That was an experience for me too when I was in high school where I was messing around with like notation softwares. This would have been around like 2000, 2001, so probably well before you were We didn't have voice memos back then, actually. At least I didn't have access to those, but I was like somehow finding notation software, not even Finale or Sibelius. I don't remember the name of it, but something free that I could pull MIDI files into, and I was kind of working with like rudimentary arranging and stuff like that, messing around with them. And then it wasn't until high school for me too that my friends would play some of my music with me, and just realizing like, oh yeah, they have to breathe, if it's a wind instrument, or just having that kind of performer sensibility to the way you write music. I mean, I feel very lucky to kind of happened into that early on, and it sounds like that was the case for you too.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say maybe that's one of the great parts of music making at a young age, getting into bands and anything like that. It started off as just like a class that I took and became a real part of my experience growing up. And yeah, I think there's a lot of like musicality that you discover when you just start to write for the first time. And I actually say a lot working in the game space. What's interesting is we might live in a period of time where there's more composers writing digitally by far than there are composers writing for live ensembles. So there's almost like different experiences and identities of being a composer beyond just like cultural boundaries. There's a real almost like technology workflow difference now too.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear more about that, but I want to kind of keep moving chronologically here and ask you,
Mm.
when was your first encounter? And this could be, I guess, both encounter in real life, person to person, and I guess an encounter with someone's music. But when was your first encounter with a composer?
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. My background growing up as a black kid, there are no composers in my family. There were not many musicians in my extended family, even. And so meeting a composer actually was very late in comparatively. I'd say the first composer I met was maybe Johann de May, a
Oh yeah.
composer who, yeah, does a lot of wind ensemble works and whatnot. I met Johann de May, and I also met Frank Kelly through the South Florida Pride Wind Band. Actually, I was a student in those ensembles and they came to do clinics. And so this was a volunteer ensemble where I got to actually see a composer, how they worked, what they did, things like that. Though, of course, you could say I met composers who I maybe didn't really see as like composers at the time, not because they weren't good enough or anything, but just because the mindset, I did marching band a lot. And there's a lot of people doing a ton of arranging and marching ensembles, so in a way, I was exposed to composers through that way as well. But I think meeting those two was the first time I was like, okay, I really met someone who this is like their career path. This is what they do.
I think you're the first person since I was in high school, which has been about over 15 years now, who who knows who Johann de May is. Not maybe not knows who he is, but has mentioned him in conversation. And I
Mm,
remember in high school we played his I think he had like a suite of Lord of the Rings music that was not the same as like the movie music for, the Peter
yeah.
Jackson Lord of the Rings. And so that's really cool. I mean, he's European as well, so it's really
Hmm.
interesting that that was like your first encounter.
I mean, when you put it in context, it's kind of a really unique experience because doesn't live in the US, came all this way to Florida of all places, and that's where I got to play some of his music. I think I'm also fortunate that he's a really seems seemingly down to earth person from my experience meeting him as a kid, and yeah, I'd say that was really impactful in the sense that even the idea of doing a clinic, a composer going and working with an ensemble for a performance, that was my first time ever experiencing that. And I think once I got into university, that became more common. But, I'd say those experiences being that young were really impactful. I probably didn't think, oh, I'll be a band composer or
Mm,
compose for these ensembles, but just that exposure, I think, does a lot. People don't even know what's possible until maybe they see it.
right, right. So one of the many reasons that I wanted to talk with you, and what kind of sets you apart from the other composers that I've had on the podcast so far, is that you are heavily involved in making music and sounds, I should say, music and sounds for video games. So I'd really love to hear more about this, and I'll admit that a lot of my questions are focused in on this part of your work. So I'll just start by asking you, when did you first become interested in video game music, and how did you initially start I guess you've kind of answered that already a little bit, but how did you initially start making it?
Yeah, I'd say those times where I started getting into virtual instruments were my very early exposure to film and game composers who they just work really differently. They're so focused on the digital side of things. And when I was just on the internet, 14, 15 years old, trying to get a grasp of how to work with these instruments, that's when I started to see, oh, there's people just uploading things on SoundCloud and just putting music out there. And that's where I really got started making music. I would upload really bad music for many years to SoundCloud back in its heyday. And I would say that wasn't necessarily me saying, oh, this is game music, but it was kind of like in this ambiguous area where film and game composers will upload these different portfolio tracks or whatnot to the internet. When I first started to really come into contact with like a concrete idea of being a game composer, I'd say is when I met some people online. For example, I remember coming into contact with someone who game audio people might know, Emmanuel Lagumba, who is now working on Guild Wars as a sound designer, but at the time was uploading a lot of League of Legends fan music. And we came across each other's music, and that was like my first exposure to maybe meeting someone who's trying to do the same thing I am, becoming a game composer. And that was really awesome. That's when I was sort of like, okay, well, maybe these tracks can be for an imaginary film or an imaginary game. And yeah, that's where things started. Though since you had Balgender on the show, once I got into university, that's where my whole world got flipped upside down
Right.
and I got exposed to quote unquote new music, you know? At the time when I was coming into university, I was like, oh, I'm gonna do everything. I'll be a great film composer, a great game composer. I'll be a great composer of classical music. And at the same time, I really didn't know much about either of those parts of the music making world. And yeah, I think Balgender is a great person to sort of like pick up someone like that because I got really interested into the classical music space. And at the same time, I was like, well, I have 4 years in university and I'm writing a lot of classical music. Maybe at the same time, I'll start to really try to actually like build a career doing film and game music as well. And that was sort of my master plan that, hey, 4 years, I have 4 years to kind of make something happen. And that's where I really got things going.
I mean, I recall you as a maybe 17 or 18-year-old arriving as a freshman in college, and you were already doing the game stuff. And what's interesting, what people who don't know Balgender's curriculum or what USF was like at that time, it's very, very different from gaming music world. I mean, like you said, night and day. Do you think there's a universe where, I mean, I can only think of a handful of university programs that have a video game music program. Actually, I'm not far from one where I live in Cincinnati. Susanna teaches at Miami University, and they have one, and so a lot of her students are doing kind of what you do. But do you think there's a universe where you would have went to a program like that? Did you have access to something like that, or was it basically like your options were programs like USF that were very heavily contemporary classical music practices?
I only had like an inkling of what I was even getting myself into. Nowadays, if I'm applying to a program, I really do my research and I understand what I'm looking at. But back then, I think I would look at, okay, what people went to this school, what does their music sound like? And I would get kind of a hint of like what output composers are even doing in the classical space today. But I didn't really have an understanding of like a classical music program being a big departure from, what I was familiar with. Of course, once I got exposed to it, I was like, whoa, this music's completely different than I don't know, the
Yeah.
John Williams
Right.
music I was listening to and stuff. And yeah, that was a game changer. I'd say the reason I ended up applying at schools like USF at the time, I'd applied to Florida schools. I'd say mainly just because, financial circumstance. The Bright Futures Scholarship and whatnot in Florida allowed students to receive funding for Florida schools. So I applied at UF, at USF. I think I almost applied at UCF as well. I was kind of a late applicant to most of those programs because I really didn't know what I was doing. I had this portfolio of random tracks I'd created, just like many undergrad applicants coming in. And I played flute. So I thought, okay, I'll play flute. It doesn't help that a lot of schools will say, okay, you're going to be more instrumentally focused the first 2 years. USF was the rare exception. I don't think I could have ended up at a games program at that time. I do say in the current events of today, game music programs are taking off. They're becoming more and more popular. They're becoming more and more present. And it's made me, being now on the other side in the industry, think, well, what makes a good program and what is actually appealing to students? What do they need to know? Things like that. And yeah, I don't think I could have ended up in a program back then, but I think it's an interesting opportunity to explore for people now for sure.
Yeah. So, was it high school when you knew that you wanted to pursue composition as a career, or did that come later? Like you're describing, you formulated this master plan after 4 years at USF. Was that when you decided? What? Tell me about that a little bit.
I'd say for most of high school, I thought I would be a chemical engineer. I think a lot of people in high school kind of just they don't really know what they're picking, as a career. They kind of just gravitate towards something. And I thought I was a pretty smart kid. In retrospect, I don't think I was smart enough for chemical engineering. But around my junior year of high school, I became very just deeply invested in music. I was doing wind ensemble. I was in jazz band. I was in indoor percussion. I was in indoor winds. And this was all at the same time. So my extracurricular musical activities were just through the roof. I was also, doing all the leadership stuff people do
Yeah,
in
yeah.
marching band and whatnot. And I'd really sort of found my social circle basically being all musicians at that time. And that's where I was really sort of like, okay, this is kind of like what I live and breathe at the moment. Do I even really want to be a chemical engineer? And before I knew it, before I was even applying to university, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna do music. And you can imagine my family was like, what? They were always supportive, but I think I'd always been a kid who was kind of like pragmatic, so to speak. I knew that if I was going to do this, I felt like I needed to approach it differently than any way that I knew. And my strategy there was to become sort of I guess, a chameleon, to outwork whatever barriers there were to try and get into film, get into game, and get into classical music all at the same time. And that was sort of my master plan that if I had 4 years to do it, I could do a lot of damage in that time. And
Mm.
I mean, I'd say it worked out, not as that plan was envisioned, but through circumstances that were really favorable, which we could definitely get into.
Yeah, sure. No, I totally relate to what you're saying about being a chameleon. And I think there's like two ways of looking at it. You could look at it from like a chameleon, like your musical voice, which I maybe these two things are intertwined, but you can be a musical chameleon, stylistic chameleon. You are
Mhm.
that, or like in the jobs that you do, chameleon kind of thing. And I was the same way. Neither of my parents are musicians. No one else in my family really are musicians, other than like like maybe one or two hobby musicians. And so for me to go into college and then to go to grad school for music composition, I my mom was like going up to Balgender, I think, asking like, will he really be able to like make a career out of this? Will he be able to make money? Because of course our parents want us to be financially secure and stable and have a good life and be able to protect ourselves and all that kind of stuff. And for me, I've never really done. game or film music, but I guess my equivalent would be all the radio stuff that I do. That's where I found security. And in a lot of ways, that has led me to really approach the music that I make, the art music, I guess I'll say. My approach has become very liberal with that, in that I can kind of take on the projects I want to do. And so I think that chameleon strategy that you're describing, I kind of wish more people thought about that, because I think it would be enormously helpful.
Yeah, it's super interesting you say that. I mean, we're a few years apart, but I feel like it's almost like a generational shift in composers today. I have a collective with my friends who were all in the freshman class at USF, and that's Benjamin Kohler, Tucker Johnson, and Han Hitchin. And we all sort of, in different ways, identify with this idea that, like, you don't have to be composing all the time to be a composer. Like, being a composer is an identity. It's not so much related to exactly what you're doing day in, day out. And I think now that we live in this internet age where, you and I can get online and do a podcast
Yeah.
together, and the radio is always innovating itself. It makes me think a lot about what you said, where being in something adjacent or being a chameleon has a lot of utility nowadays, where being strictly a composer is really tough. But not only that, where people have technical proficiencies to do so much. A lot of kids nowadays are growing up with computers, heck, even iPads now, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I think we're seeing a lot of people just dabble in making music. The barriers to entry are lower than ever. And I think that's just great. And I think from a career perspective, I think it's only right that, you and I, at our respective points in our path, explored these other avenues, because I think they do pair very well with being a composer. And I guess my last thought on that is, I have always thought about maybe what my professors have done, right? A lot of them teach, but they have careers for their music as well. And so I was kind of always like, well, doing something else like game music or film music or even working another job won't actually stop me from making classical music. But it does empower you to make music more liberally, like you said, where
Yeah.
you can take off that maybe that financial burden a bit and free up, maybe your artistic choices and flexibility that way.
So I'm really, like I said, I'm not a composer who does game music, film music, any of that kind of stuff. I mean, the closest I've ever
Mhm.
done is I've scored like choreography before, but that was like still in a classical dance, contemporary classical music and dance kind of sense. So I really want to dig into your process and ask you about these two worlds that you live in. So I want to start by asking you, what is your approach to making music for games and sound design in a broad sense?
Mhm. It's deeply collaborative. That's the biggest thing that I note when it comes to doing commissioned work, is how I'll broadly say it. And that can relate to classical music and game music. Game music, making music and making games is incredibly interdisciplinary. It often starts with getting an understanding of who you're working with, what they're building up, what game project they have, and trying to immerse yourself in that. There's, of course, then like the technical side of it, of like, how do we actually create this thing? As far as like broad, high level, I always say good music does not mean it's great music for your game. And I think you can loosely connect that to classical music as well. Writing a great piece does not mean it'll meet the goals of your commissioner, which
Sure, yeah.
many great composers have encountered that, I imagine. And yeah, I think the process of making game music is really built around connecting with the people who are you are working with, understanding like from a team vision what you're doing, and then trying to like really bring that to the highest creative level. There's a real craft aspect to it, of like building your chops to like, make sure your demos sound great and make sure you can write and whatnot. But that's sort of like the big arc to it. And I always say it's like working on a big group project in school. You're going to have different people with different strengths, and there's sort of this unusual obstacle course you have to run to get from point A to point B. And your job as the composer in that case is to try and really be creative and artistic yourself, but also use your experience to like navigate that interdisciplinary environment. And you say you did the classical contemporary music and dance, and I can imagine that being quite similar as far as like just creative, like, okay, what are we going to work with, what's the idea, what's the vision, and then how does the choreography and music fit together. And I always say, it never felt too alien to me to work on games, because that sort of mentality of collaborating is a big part of many processes.
And I think there's this kind of stereotype of composers that maybe society at large sees us as like singular people sitting in a room by ourselves, like composing by candlelight, that classic kind of
I wish.
stereotype. Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of like alone time, and that's why I love being a composer. But what you're describing, it like turns that on its head 180 degrees. I mean, it's what would you say is the ratio between like you spending time writing music alone versus working with these groups, like meeting with the team, so to speak?
I'd say this is like one of the main like points of conflict for many game composers. Firstly, many game composers are not in-house, so to speak. They don't work with companies. They're freelance and working as a contractor. Generally speaking, that means you're going to be less connected with the teams compared to, say, like a programmer or even a sound designer. I did a ton of sound design work, so I got really used to being neck and neck, really deeply involved with the teams I'm working on. And that sort of has bled into my work as a composer, where it seems like I'm deeply integrated with the teams I'm working with. This can be good and bad
Yeah.
because if you talk to in-house composers who kind of usually have that sort of relationship, they're going to tell you, I hate being in all these meetings. I just want to write music. There's so many point A to point B. It's like to get your music in the game, there's all these technical hurdles. You don't want to have meetings bogging that down and creative hurdles at the same time. So I'd say like nowadays I have maybe too many meetings. I'd say like 60-40, like 60% in meetings talking to people and stuff like that. And the rest spent hopefully making music. And that's been the main challenge in my career right now, is that I'm kind of like in a lot of meetings. And of course, being a freelance composer, you're often working with multiple games at the same time. So you can imagine Slack, it's popping,
Mm, yeah.
Discord, a lot going on, and emails and stuff. And so I think the next level for composers like me is to become the master of your whole like work life balance and all that stuff. But it's a good problem to have, I guess, having work that is abundant. Now, I have talked to composers though who are ahead of where I'm at, who are like, when I went from in-house to freelance, or when I cut down on meetings, I felt like a different composer. But I explored this a lot in university too. Like, oh, how do I write music when I have all these classes, and I have to do X, Y, and Z. And I was contracting full time on multiple games while in my graduate degree as well. So this became a really, really key balance. Like, how can I be present in full time work while also being in school? So yeah, it has a lot of different strategies. Like maybe you become a fast composer, or you do something like I think Cal Newport has a book about deep work. This concept of immersing yourself super quickly into your work and getting into that flow state, that whole time management sort of thing.
So as we're talking about this, we're both differentiating between music and sound.
Mhm.
And so when we talk about composing game music, that's probably a little different from like composing concert music, but for the most part, like the Venn diagram is probably very much overlapping the two
Mhm.
circles. But when we talk about sound design in video games, that seems like a completely different ball game to me, at least. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that?
on my website, I used to say the intersection of music and sound. A bit of a marketing ploy, but I also think that some composers you may know who say, music is sound, sound is music, this relationship of the two. I always resonated with that artistically. And I've always felt like my sound design work has fueled my music work, and my music work has fueled my sound work. Now that I'm really only doing music work and a lot less sound work, it's been interesting sort of like putting it all into perspective. I think the creative side of sound design reminds me a lot of like orchestrating. Sound designers are thinking about, okay, is this sound source very tonal, but not tonal like keys, but like having actual pitch, discrete pitch, maybe the more like accurate description of the term tonal. And they might differentiate between sources that are noise based and tonal. So, if you have a metal pipe that would resonate and have a discrete pitch and be very tonal. But if you have, say, a blast of white noise, well, that's very noisy, such a broad frequency spectrum. And so I always really connected that with like maybe how I orchestrate. Like,
Mm.
I don't know, if you put a slap tongue on a saxophone with a snare hit, you're going to have a very percussive sound and you can alter the timbres and whatnot. And I think that's really connected to how sound designers think as well. And I find a lot of sound designers started as composers too. They feel connected to the sound design process before they even get into sound design. Now, there is like a lot of technical difference in the workflows. I mean, we all use DAWs for sure, but sound designers have a larger burden on them for sort of using what we call middleware. These are the programs and softwares that you use to get sounds and music into a game. So we have all the game engines. The middleware connects the game engine to the audio, so to speak. And that was a big difference in my work. I became really proficient at the coding and using middleware. So I became very technical at the same time. And that's very removed from, say, maybe like the traditional game composer process. But what it is connected to is maybe something like Super Collider or Max MSV. Very familiar where, you're sort of designing technical systems and trying to, sort of emit sounds in a unique way.
So for those of us who play video games, which I am someone who does that, so and I'm sure many people listening have at least played some video games at some point in their life. I think we all would recognize, okay, this is the music. Like there might be, especially in these newer kind of like PS5, Xbox,
Mm.
Nintendo Switch games, like it might be like orchestral sounding music or something like that. How would we recognize a sound that's been designed by a person in a video game? Is that everything else? Is someone creating that from scratch?
In general, people are creating the rest of the sounds. Like let's take a recent game like God of War, Ragnarok. Kratos, this fictional Greek character, has these godly powers and he can like swing his axe and stuff. Now you'll hear all this music going on in game, but the team had to do a ton of work to design, okay, what does his axe sound like? What does it sound like when it hits something? How does he sound when he's tired? What does it sound like when you're in a forest and in the snow? These are people getting really deep into the details and creating content around that. Now, when we work with instruments, you could say that's like almost like the sound libraries of
Right.
sound designers. There's teams out there who what they do is they record a lot of source material and they might put that for sale. And sound designers are using a ton of that, but of course, they're also recording a lot of the material themselves. So it's kind of like almost like making a video. You might have stock libraries you draw from, you might film content yourself, and all that makes it into the final product. But traditionally, the term soundtrack can include, the music, the voiceover, the sound effects. And I think splitting things up like that as a player makes a lot of sense, but comes together in a really unique way in a lot of these newer games.
Yeah, it's all really fascinating to me, and I don't know, I've never really had to give it much thought until I've talked to you. So
Well, that's also what we say in the industry, right?
right.
Sound design should be invisible. it should feel so immersive that you don't question it. But of course, there's so many, creative ways you can push the relationship of the player with the game, which we're seeing a lot of games do where I don't know, there's a game Lethal Company where you have voice chat with your friends, but I'm seeing a lot of these games that okay, well, if you step into a cavernous environment, your voice chat gets reverb applied to it. They're trying to put you into your character as much as possible and sort of like immerse you and then take you out of it and have all these sort of like playing with the player's emotions and expectations and stuff. And I think that's the new thing a lot of games are doing really well.
Yeah, that's wild. And that's all just programmed into the code of the game.
Yeah, it's a lot of coding. There's also these middleware softwares I mentioned. For example, Fmod Studio and Wise are the two popular ones. They allow people like us who come from a more audio oriented background to access these features that will let us do things like okay, you can put your music in and crossfade it, or you can set up deep programmatic controls like for example, I was working on a project where we have different music based on the biome you're in. So if you're in a forest, you're in a desert, things like that. And then what kind of layers creep up in intensity when your health is low. Sound designers are doing this with their sounds as well. I mentioned God of War. I love what the team did on that game. They'll do something like this enemy is about to hurt you really bad compared to other enemies. So they'll be a bit more louder to you.
Mm.
And that's an invisible way of directing your attention as a player. So they got this stuff down to a science really. It's a real art, but it's also like so deep technically that it's amazing. But whenever I think, okay, Bethesda hasn't released Elder Scrolls 6 in about 12 years, maybe
Yeah.
I understand a bit of why.
Yeah, they just keep re-releasing Skyrim.
Yeah.
Which I love, but yeah, I guess we've come a long way since I started playing video games. I mean, I started with the Super Nintendo and even the NES, and
Mm.
obviously that's also its own complicated bag of worms. But the fact that we're talking about biomes now in music in video games, I mean, that's just like I said, that's just really fascinating to me, and I love it.
I'm amazed at what those older games did because I mean, they're ahead of their time. Mario, I mean, Mario alone is still making some of the best audio I've ever heard. Things like, okay, when you go on a zip line, it's going to harmonize that sound with the music by passing MIDI information to the
Right.
zip line, and it's very musical and whatnot. And even back then, you pick up a coin, well, it has a major connotation to it, so it sounds positive and reinforces you to pick up coins. They did so much really great stuff even back then.
With a lot more, well, wildly more limitations, I'll say.
Yeah, I don't know how they did it.
So we're talking a lot about video game music, of course, but your body of work truly is well rounded. You know, you said it yourself. You're a chameleon, so you do all the contemporary classical stuff for this concert music. You do experimental music, electroacoustic music, and of course the video game stuff. And you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'll ask you more directly. How exactly is video game music different from concert music? And in your work, how do they inform one another?
Yeah, outside of like the creative vision, the true thing to know when being a game composer, and I think this can rub a lot of classical composers the wrong way. What you're doing is in service to the game. You and everyone on your team is collaborating to make this final game the best it can be for players. And that means that sometimes your music takes a back seat, just like in film. It might need to be underscored, it might need to sit behind the dialogue. You're not always the star of the show, so to speak. So, as a game composer, you have to become an expert at understanding where the focus is going to be, how to serve the moment of the game, and also how to still best represent yourself. And I think that's very different than the process of composing for classical music, where you're expecting people to sit in a concert hall and, listen to your music on a stage in the dark,
Right.
things like that. Though, of course, even that's changing. I mean, as you know, with terroir,
Mm,
putting the music in different environments and stuff. And yeah, I just think that's one of the key disconnects. I think film composers definitely relate to that side of game music, but for classical music, even the idea of having your music take the backseat kind of seems like salon music again
right,
for
right.
composers. But I'll say it's a deep, complex, interdisciplinary project, and it's just like when Stravinsky made the Rite of Spring to go with all that choreography. To make that whole final vision, there is a balancing act to do, and maybe it's not all that different when you really break it down to all the great operas and whatnot that people enjoy. But I think that is a core mentality shift compared to like putting on a chamber music performance versus working on a game.
Yeah. Can you give a specific example of how your work in one world has informed the other?
Well, firstly, being in classical music gave me a toolbox of a lot of diverse sounds. I'll say the big turning point for me was bridging my experience as a flute player playing contemporary music to the video game space. One of the things that really helped propel my music forward was that I could present the flute to an audience in a way they've never really seen. What I mean is using flute in a contemporary space, I'll do a ton of multiphonics and growls, and the flute will sound huge and monstrous. And this goes against maybe the stereotypical interpretation of the flute as very delicate and light. And when I would do these videos, I found that people were mind blown. They were like, wow, I didn't know the flute could do that. And I think kind of taking a concerto approach to my video game music has let that shine, where maybe I'll have like almost like a Lou Harrison percussion
Yeah.
backdrop with a solo instrument. That worked really well in bringing these diverse playing techniques to the forefront in a game format, and that was really successful. Of course, when you look at the more traditionally orchestral side of things, for example, Star Wars Jedi Survivor just released recently, and the composers who worked on that are very deeply entrenched in classical music. The way they orchestrate and stuff is like very, very much using a lot of contemporary techniques. And that score released for free, by the way, which is kind of historical. The full PDF score is on Dropbox, released by the composers on Twitter. And if you look through that, there's a lot of playing techniques and stuff that are not too different from contemporary music. And so I always think about that when I sit down to write game music of how can I draw from all the amazing sounds in the classical world and bring them to game audiences who might not be used to it. And it's not so much of a disconnect. I think a lot of people are consider contemporary music niche, but I think there is a ton of amazing sounds in that space and people are excited to hear them. And I think when you package it in a game, it helps people get into it.
Yeah, I think primarily operating in the concert music world, contemporary music does seem niche, but that's because we only see, at least in my experience, the film and game music composers, they kind of get separated out from the concert music composers. So I think we're like, oh yeah, contemporary music is a highly specialized niche thing, but that's like film and game is where contemporary music kind of thrives in a lot of ways. That's my perspective at least.
Yeah, I talked to Balgender about that at one point. I said, well, games, you have maybe a chance to be in front of an orchestra more than if you're a classical composer. Getting orchestral commissions is so, so hard in the classical space. But for games, it's hard to get a budget that allows you to do a full soundtrack with orchestra, but it's a lot more likely that you might be able to get at least one track with live instruments, or you can spend your time in the DAW sort of leveraging these libraries that have sampled a lot of these interesting extended techniques. And in that sort of context, I have been able to represent my contemporary music mindset in games, and that has been really great. And it's something I do tell my my friends. I'm like, hey, if you do get involved in the industry as like a composer or orchestrator, it can be really fun. If you can avoid maybe the pitfalls of the industry, you
Right.
can still really express yourself in an experimental way. I think the bad taste in people's mouths when they talk about game or film music is that they think it's dumbed down or something, or like not as experimental. I'll say it's just like finding the right commissioner to work with you in the classical space. You want to work with people who are great people to work with, who have great creative vision, and that extends to games as well. And if you're working with the right people, you can be experimental and really represent your art in a unique way.
I will say that when I wrote all of my orchard pieces, my solo piano pieces, that was to fill a void for myself. And I just, I found the commissioners, the pianists who commissioned that piece, and we started playing it and recording it and releasing it online and all this kind of stuff. And then people started messaging me like, have you played Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild? Your music sounds exactly like the score in that game. And I was like, no, I haven't played it. And then I ended up playing it a few years later and I was like, "Oh, how did that happen?" But I think
uh-huh.
it's because, like you're saying, all the contemporary music, idioms and styles and all that stuff is making its way into the video game music world and really being embraced. And actually I had a fun conversation recently with Balgender where he said something like, everyone now thinks my music sounds like Legend of Zelda music. And it's just, I think that's just people making connections between the two worlds, really.
Yeah, I actually remember digging through the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom music. And I remember the unique perspective of being in the classical world is that a lot of these game composers are referencing the greats, so to speak. It's very circular. I remember listening to it and saying, oh, wow, it sounds like this track was really inspired by Steve Reich or other minimal composers. Or I remember hearing one track. I don't remember if it was from Zelda, but I remember hearing, I think this was actually from maybe Dragon Quest or something, where it was clearly like Ravel inspired, and I could pinpoint the exact piece it was inspired by too. And I remember showing some of my collaborators on the team, and they were like, "Oh wow, this really is where they got it from, so to speak." And I think the best composers in this space always have their ear to the ground. They're always listening for everything, and it is amazing too how games can establish an idiom like the fourths and fifths and sixths being stacked in the Zelda games recently in these soloistic piano gestures and stuff. I could see how someone could relate that to the orchard.
Yeah.
um and I could imagine they would be inspired by your music too, because of the moments where you might use extended techniques or how you're inspired by the different plants and stuff. I think that is how a game composer thinks in some ways too, where they might say, this that exists in the game world, how can we systematically represent that? And that's what's really cool to me about that piece of yours. And also what's cool to me about what game composers do sometimes. It's like that model based approach
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like there are more opportunities? And when I say opportunities, I mean like job and career opportunities in the game music world versus the concert music world? Because it seems like that's sort of the path you're going down. You've graduated with your master's from Penn State, and that I'm guessing that was also heavily contemporary concert music oriented. But you're working as a game composer for the most part. That seems quite intentional.
Part of it is by luck. When I was in my undergrad, I met up with a person named Ryan Stunkel, and he ran a game audio team called Blipsounds. And this is where I really started getting immersed in sound design. Ryan ran Blipsounds, and Blipsounds did a lot of education actually at first, but around the time I graduated from USF, Blipsounds became a full on game audio contracting team. And by the time I got out of my grad degree, I had already been essentially contracting for a few years on various pretty heavy game contracts. And around that midpoint of my grad degree, my music side of things really took off too, because I started working with different teams in a freelance capacity just on the music. So essentially, by the time I finished my graduate degree, I was already just like seamlessly working full time on many different games. I'll say though, there was a point I was very lucky. I was making way too much money for a student. I
No
told
such thing. There's no such thing as that.
yeah, for real. I told Han Hitchin, who is a composer, but also my partner. I remember looking at like the year and I was like, I don't think I'll ever make this much again. I think it might be downhill from here. And the next year came and it stayed stable. And the next year came and it stayed stable. And that was sort of a sign that I felt like I was doing something really well, that I was managing to showcase my talents in a unique way, but also keep meeting people and, growing my network. And the way I see it is I always really embrace the idea of kind of just being a fan. I'm a fan of games. I'm always going to have my ear to what's interesting in the game world. Just like with classical music, I had commissions going for classical music and I keep doing them still. Recently, I worked with Matchstick Percussion that started at Penn State. And those things are really fulfilling projects still. And I found that the amount of like time I needed to invest in classical music to stay fulfilled and keep making music was less demanding as far as like being in meetings and stuff like that
Yeah,
for game
absolutely.
music. So I said, well, this is the perfect pair. Just like you can be a professor and do classical music, I can be in both musical worlds. Maybe that's something good to say about both of them, right? I'd say the barriers of entry to making game music are lower because you can download free VSTs on a very dated computer and start making music right away. And you could say this is game inspired music. And you can join a free game jam and start working on games with people over the course of a weekend. And that's really great. And that could be a gateway to higher paying jobs. I also think the education and the path in the industry is a lot clearer in the game industry of like, how do you connect what you do to making money? But you could also say classical music, all you have to do is, listen to music. You could pull out a pen and a pad and you could start writing. But I do think the live performance aspect is a bit of a hurdle, which music programs help a lot to alleviate. But of course, you could go full electroacoustic or electronic purely and make some really cool stuff and probably submit to calls and whatnot. But I do think financially, it is a bit harder to navigate. How do you transition the classical space into well-paying, secure opportunities? In a lot of ways, they're both very freelance network dependent. There are composers out there who have huge success, connecting with different ensembles and whatnot. But I think there's a lot of groundwork, so to speak. You have to meet a ton of people in the classical space and be around a long time to make that sort of impact. Now, the game industry is in a tough spot.
Yeah,
The
sure.
layoffs have been wild. Like record breaking layoffs for the past 6 months to a year. And this has sort of been complex. It means that being an employee of a game studio is not super desirable right now because companies are laying people off left and right. But it does mean for someone who's a contractor, you might have more staying power. And, it is an unfortunate cycle of the game industry. I was literally just talking with my friend today about this, that like it's not seen as a place that's investment for your career as an employee working as a company. It seems like a lot of people are trying to take control, get out of the big company relationships and be freelancers, be contractors, or work with their peers to form a studio and make their own games. And that's because, companies have been cutting left and right. You'll see Microsoft layoffs, you'll see a bunch of different studios getting closed and whatnot. So you could say that, yeah, you'll make more money in this industry, but it's also one that might get rid of you just like that. And that's why I try to maintain a lot of agency on the freelance side. Whereas on the flip side, if you get a tenured job at a university, they might never fire you. Like, it's very hard to get fired as a tenured professor, and so that can be desirable in a way that's unique from, say, games.
Yeah. Do you ever see yourself going down the more academic path again, or do you feel like you've kind of hit your sweet spot, you enjoy doing this, and you want to sustain this for quite some time?
It's very interesting. At the moment, actually, at Penn State, I do teach a game audio course online, and as I completed my master's degree, I said, okay, should I do a doctoral program? The iron is very hot on games right now, and I'm very stable. Do I want to jump in a 6 year degree?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I told myself no. But I did say, well, game audio is becoming very popular in universities because it's filling seats. And I had a lot of support at Penn State to get a game audio course off the ground. And that's a remote course that I'm able to teach from anywhere. So it was a perfect pair for me to get invested in the academic route while also still being in games. I also have some friends in the industry who, teach at schools as well remotely. And it does seem like it's becoming a bit of like a thing some people do who have that unique background of upper education and working in games. I have seen schools looking for full time professors for game audio related things. I think there is a healthy connection between things like the middleware we use and stuff like Max MSP. Or you might even find people who are very deep into DSP and stuff like that who can pair well into these programs. So it's always something I'm investing in. Of course, the biggest barrier on the university side is doctoral degrees, terminal degrees seem to be very desired, but you're not going to find many people with the terminal degree at all in the game industry. But universities are finding that these courses fill seats a lot. And yeah, so that's kind of been where game courses seem to be taking off. And yeah, I guess I'm a bit of a part of being in that wave, at least at Penn State, and it's something I'm still interested in continuing. There are some people in the industry who are veterans who, when they go to sort of exit the game industry, they are going into full time teaching positions. These are kind of rare. There's some schools that do this, like Full Sail, which already had a audio sort of focus. But I could see this becoming an avenue if universities keep investing in expanding these courses and maybe getting tenure track positions or just, full time positions. As for me, I'd love to see it grow and keep sort of being in both worlds for sure.
Yeah.
But it is tough. I did have a potential opportunity to work in person for a game university position, and I had to turn it down because it was just like not a good fit for my lifestyle, being fully remote and still not really knowing where I'm going to, like, end up in the next year or so as far as like where I'll be moving to. But hey, someone has to get hired for the job, and I think that that'd be a great opportunity for people out there. And I think more of that is good. I'm always trying to be flexible, have that that exit plan, so to speak.
Yeah, it's all really interesting. Shifting gears just a little bit, and I want to pose a question to you that I ask everybody, and that is, what would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice?
The way I see this is I very much value experimentation. And I think I try to break down what I mean by experimentation. I don't necessarily mean that as like making the most unique or out there music or anything, but I value it as meaning that I want risk taking to be a part of my creative process and a part of the process of the people that I collaborate with as well. I don't want to leave anything on the table, so to speak, or off the table, more like it. I want to be very fulfilled by tapping into new ideas. And one way I've tried to describe it is that even when I sit down to make a game track, I try to feel like what I'm about to make is going to be a new experience for me, something I haven't made before. I don't want to make the same thing twice, whether it be game music or classical music. So that experimentation part, I think, encapsulates that mentality. I do also think that a core thing for me has just been variety. I talk about being a chameleon and this and that. I don't consider myself necessarily a chameleon, as in like, oh, I'll do anything to land the job, so to speak. But I consider it more like I feed off of a variety of musical stimulus. I love being able to listen to classical music and then go to a new tab and hear, I don't know, like metal music or something, and then go to another tab and hear Breath of the Wild soundtrack. I like to be immersed in the music world, and I try to present myself as an artist broadly who can just work in these different pockets. I think one of my sort of dreams as a composer is to reach a level of like, I guess, status or network where I have full flexibility of the creative projects I embark on. And I think that has always excited me when maybe I look at the careers of composers like Stravinsky or something, where you never really know what they're going to quite do next. And, Stravinsky went to like France, Russia, the US, it's kind of like a globetrotter in his own way. And I think now, being in an internet age where you could do things remote, I think there's a high chance to sort of like work in spaces I've never been in before, work with people I've never worked with before, and to do it from the comfort of this
Oh,
exact
yeah.
chair I'm sitting in. So those are, I guess, two pillars. I'd say if there's a third, I'll say agency. And when talking about the game industry and how tough it is on the people that invest in it, I have always valued having that personal level of control over what I do. And so you could connect that to the variety and the experimentation. But I think that when I orient my career and what I do, I think a lot about combining all of these to say, no one can hold me to just one thing. I can have the flexibility to take my creative talents where I want. And that has caused me trouble in my career in some aspects, in the sense that like when an opportunity presents itself to like sort of like lock in with one employer, it could be a very, very tough sell for me. Or if something seems to be taking a lot of space in my creative output, it can be very tough to sort of want that to even happen. But I do think, as I was saying, being in the internet age and having that remote flexibility has done a lot. Also, maybe more of like industry changes, but in the US, non compete agreements are unenforceable now. So now it's like really on, like really out there that like people can in the US do what they want, so to speak. But that's maybe my part of the industry to navigate with the people I work with. And I try to always let people know, like, yeah, these are the things I'm about, this is what I do, these are things that I'm working on. And I try to really present myself with those kind of pillars in mind.
Yeah, that's really good stuff. And I wanted to point out that your bio, there's a line in your bio that says, your eclectic body of work seeks to reshape musical idioms and embrace experimentation, which you're talking about. But could you give like a specific example of what this means exactly?
Yeah, besides being just a, I guess, fancy line for the bio, when I think of reshaping idioms, I think that's a big part of being a game composer. You should be thinking about the idea that, well, these are impossible universes that have never been seen before. We should make some impossible music for it. And I think about that by looking at maybe idioms that exist in the inspirations for the games I'm working on and trying to reshape them in a way that is like completely different or unexpected. One example is I've been working with Lunchbox Entertainment on their upcoming game for about 2 years now. And there's just this impossible combination of cultures, and it's like such a unique sort of interpretation of them. Instead of maybe appropriating those cultures, I've tried to recontextualize almost like the history of the cultures in the game universe. What kind of instruments would they use that are particular to this game? What kind of like format or ensembles would the music even exist in? And that sort of led to actually the concerto approach for the flute that I'm doing, where there's this wild, distorted flute playing on top of a bed of percussion instrumentation. And there's actually a style of music that does that almost, and that is gamelan music. You have arrhythmic flute on top of amazing percussion. And that was a way of sort of contextualizing that ensemble in a way that was unique to my voice and also unique to the universe of the game. And I think this is important to keep in mind, when working on these games and films, even that have a lot of creative license to them. We shouldn't maybe always be trying to represent authenticity, but sometimes trying to really embrace the impossible. And that can mean kind of understanding the idioms of the music and reshaping it. In the classical space, we see composers do this. I like Alex Temple's music. Alex Temple
Yeah.
came to Pennsylvania and visited Penn State recently, and Alex Temple's music, she utilizes a lot of, pop or rock idioms in the classical space. And I know that can really rub people the wrong way depending on who you show it to. I noticed that there's almost like a purist mentality sometimes to classical music that it can't have that pop stuff in it or that rock stuff in it. Well, I think Alex Temple's music is cool because it tries to take those idioms and put it into the classical music. And, you know, there's plenty of composers who have done that, and also artists. You could say a Frank Zappa or a Steve Reich, Julius Eastman. And I think this sort of approach to understanding the musical world we're in and the trends and reshaping them into like completely different audiences or ways of presenting it is really fun. And that's sort of how I connect it with the experimentation side.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you're saying about that and that distinction between creating something authentic and wholly new that's authentic to the world you're working within versus, being careful not to appropriate something from a culture that doesn't belong to you or belong to us as composers.
Yeah, these cultures are so fascinating. And I'll actually say I remember coming out of my graduate degree. And I think, you could think, okay, we've been through upper education, we must know everything. But I remember coming into contact with gamelan music and feeling just like wholly unprepared to even like break it down or analyze it. And that's because the culture and the purpose of the music is completely different than the Western music I was studying. And I tried to think about, well, like, how does this even fit into their world? Well, how should music maybe fit into the culture of the games that I'm in? Nowadays, you could see a lot of games using music in a diegetic sense, like in Horizon Zero Dawn. Maybe the village comes together and you have this sort of like community choral experience where they're all singing. And this is a cultural representation of a culture in the game, even if that culture might be inspired by one that's in real life.
Yeah. What is a piece of music or a song, a book, piece of art, anything along those lines that not only changed the way that you thought about your work, but even maybe changed your life in many ways?
Ooh, yeah, there's a lot. I think there's two that I think of like recently. One is the music of Tigran Hamasyan, who's an amazing jazz pianist, composer, and he's always just shredding on the keyboard, but also has this variety and depth to his music that I think is really amazing. And when I first heard Tigran's music, I was sort of like, I was blown away. I felt like this was experimentation in a way that I hadn't really seen like celebrated by people as much.
Yeah.
I think he brings his cultural background to his music in a really compelling way, but he's also got like amazing technical depth to his music, and I feel like it was a step outside of the box. I mean, you know, we listen to a lot of composers that some people would say make unlistenable music. I think you know, there's a part of knowing that contemporary music can be very niche to at times. But I also find that your taste develops, you start to say, yeah, I've heard plenty of Xenakis and I understand the musical landscape and stuff, and it's not as experimental anymore. You go look for new things, and I try to think, well, what are the new things popping up right now? Maybe my hot take is, I see Tigran and I'm like, Tigran's great, and then maybe I see other artists, that are celebrated. Um, let's see, I'll say Jacob Collier,
Yeah.
is another jazz artist who I think gets a lot of love. Nothing against his music, but I think a lot about what is experimental really, and what do I try to celebrate myself. Another musical experience that I think was really defining is Kendrick Lamar's music. Even right now, you just do not know what Kendrick Lamar is going to do at any
Right.
point in time. You don't even know what he's like going to release, when he's going to release. And in his recent rap beef with Drake, he has a line in his 616 in LA where he says he lives in the circadian rhythm of a shooting star. And
Mm,
I think those kind of lines are really impactful because he's saying that, well, shooting stars, they don't come around often. You don't know when to expect them, but they're very special and they can be really impactful. And I try to embrace that sort of mentality in my artistic career by not letting the outside world pressure my music too much.
mm,
I try to always maintain a core artistic identity of being excited by the world of music and what I do, but also having my own maybe core beliefs and way of doing things. And that doesn't mean I'm like not changing or anything. I try to always be a sponge, but I also try to again have that agency and resilience that kind of, I guess, keeps me understanding myself. And I think Kendrick Lamar as an artist really understands himself. And yeah, I mean, we don't understand his music even. And I think oftentimes the great composers have that sort of out of step with the rest of the world too. I think of Stravinsky's music where, at times he said the public is always behind his music. They'll get it later on or something. And even with contemporary music, there's plenty of times where we think maybe this composer won't be celebrated until after their time. But then there's stuff that hits the world, and immediately that it's like, oh, this is so crazy. And I think that comes from having a strong core of self clarity as an artist.
what about video games? Can you share some of your favorite video games in terms of music and sound, but also just in general? Because I'm really just curious to know what you like.
Yeah, I should shout out some games. There's a the God of War Ragnarok team blew my mind. Not necessarily with Bear McCreary's music, which was amazing, but the way the technical team managed the stems and the system, the music design was amazing to me. I heard the Sony team speak at Game SoundCon last year, and it was just completely a masterclass on how they're paying attention to player expectations and subverting them. And you have all these things like, the threat of enemies driving the music, but also this stratified system of mood based layers, melody based layers, rhythm based layers, and they dynamically change the vertical relationship of those
Yeah.
and kind of create all these unique moments in the game. So I've really loved systematic sort of approaches to composition in classical music, and it connects a lot with games. And when I see stuff like that, I think it's great. When I think of soundtracks that have been really impactful to me, there's a composer, Wilbert Roget, who I'm a big fan of. And it's interesting because I've met Wilbert and, I've heard his music, and he's on an absolute run right now because he did Helldivers 2 score. He's also scored 2 Mortal Kombat games at this point, Call of Duty World War II, Pacific Drive, which came out recently as well. Worked on some anime stuff as well with Netflix. And there's just a lot of stuff going on with his music right now. But I think at the core, when I think of his music, what's interesting to me is maybe this is a full circle thing, but he's the first composer I saw where I was like, I see myself in his music because he's a black composer who works in games and is also a flute player.
Oh
So not
wow.
only is he making really cool music, but I think he's really representative of where I'm coming from. So it's really cool just, keeping up with his music, but also knowing that like I didn't come into the industry, alone, so to speak. And it is an industry where if you look at the AAA composers and whatnot, there's not a lot of, black representation. So I think that was really cool. And of course, you mentioned Breath of the Wild and Zelda games. That music is so timeless. Even the new soundtracks, which I think some people say, "Oh, I miss the old Zelda music." I love the new Zelda music. I think it's really great, and the way they do the systems and stuff, the sort of randomly appearing gestural things, is so in tune with like the core open air concept of the game. It's really artistic.
Yeah, I'm with you. I love the old Zelda music. Actually, I mentioned earlier I would download MIDI files and pull them into notation software and tinker. A lot of that was video game music, actually. I don't know if it still exists anymore, but I think vgmusic.com or something,
Mhm.
something like that. And so when I was doing that, that was, I think we had just gotten the PS2 and maybe the Xbox hadn't quite existed. But anyway, I largely credit the music from Zelda especially, but all those kinds of games is the reason I even began having an interest in music composition in terms of just like notes on a page and working with that. But I agree, the new stuff I like even better, even though people think that my music sounds like it. So
Hey, I think when they work on the new soundtrack, maybe they should hit you up.
yeah, maybe they will. That'd be great. So when we think about writing a piece of music as a composer, no matter if it's short, like 5 to 10 minutes, or something that's larger scale, a lot of times we think about form and structure and narrative in that piece. But with video game music, and please correct me if I'm wrong, with video game music, by necessity, the music has to be kind of like short and loopable, right?
Mhm.
So, can you talk about the role of narrative in your music, both as a concert composer and as a game composer?
Yeah, it's very tricky with games because you need to think of the system and how it ties into the narrative like immediately. It's going to influence how you create the music. For example, I created a piece of music recently for a game that was entirely ambient, and that ended up being like 7 minutes of music. And then we have to think, well, okay, how does this fit into the game? So we have divided that up into maybe like a section of 3 that can arrhythmically go in and out and create, endless variety. And then some additional layers to represent the dynamic actions of the player. And that's kind of an approach to, maybe a arrhythmic approach to music making that you might see maybe someone do in classical music with arrhythmic loops or something. But then there's also the more, when we think of narrative, there's a lot of cinematic games now. And then you have to think, well, how do we have a compelling emotional arc to tracks that need to be like that? And that might involve creating the linear demo and then thinking, okay, there's going to be the intro. Maybe you have exits like when you die or you complete a battle. Then you need to think of intensities of like, okay, what do we do during a more sparse moment and a more intense moment? So it's almost like having all these variations of your piece and use cases and stuff. And sometimes these can actually be pretty long. You might take a track that was like 5 minutes and need to like spread it out into like a bunch of different stems and variations and things like that. So I think this is a very like I to use game terms, it's like a skill gap.
Yeah.
If you can understand music design, you can make systems that are really tied to the narrative. And there's a lot of games that do this in unique ways. I mean, Breath of the Wild with the open air concept, they said we're not going to have those looping musical sections where there's vertical and horizontal differences. We'll instead have long periods of silence and use these gestures that come out and represent maybe the mood of what you're doing. And I think that was a really bold choice considering the history of Zelda. And yeah, on the concert side, maybe this is good timing because I have a string quartet called State Machine that was read by the Mivos Quartet, but will end up on the Score Follower channel at some point this year. And State Machine is a game term. It means representing different states of games like death, or you're in a menu, you're out of menu, or maybe you're jumping, you're running, things like that. And I connected that to the states of matter. So solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. And what was kind of thinking was, well, what if this is a set of miniatures that represent those? So a very model based composition. But then I tried to take it a step further, like what would gaseous music look like? So the gas music is all graphically notated in this sort of faded brushstrokes done on concepts. And then also the liquid movement starts as this sort of rocking and rowing, almost like really rich Ravel like texture. But then the players are instructed to start to drift apart in pitch and rhythm until the liquid evaporates as you go into the gas music. And that's represented visually in the music too. You know, headless notes, glissandi everywhere, where the music used to look very solid. So that's kind of like a narrative within the piece where how can we represent and connect these different movements. And I think, of course, if you're writing for opera, that can be like an even bigger step.
Yeah.
Maybe my closest experience with opera is that I'm working with two musicians right now, which I hope we can announce sometime soon, which will be cool. But Erica and Zach, two friends of mine, and they're doing flute and vibraphone, and we're trying to have a unique sort of relationship between the two players with each movement. And that is actually realized through text, thematic elements where they narrate and kind of act during different parts of this piece. And one of the interesting things we did is all of the text are about two sentences, and they actually are coming from a subreddit called Two Sentence Horror. So this is a horror experience or kind of campfire eerie tales. And we sort of connected that with the historical use of penny dreadfuls, like short, bite sized, like not super complex horror tales and thrillers and whatnot. So, yeah, the narrative aspect, classical music, game music, I think it's really important to think on the onset of your piece what you're going to do. And maybe we all call that pre composition.
Yeah. Right. Well, hearing you talk about kind of the different states in the game, like there's again, it's something that is totally invisible. You don't if you as a game composer do a good job, no one's going to notice, but and I
Mhm.
haven't really noticed until you started talking about it, but yeah, like there has to be all this seamlessness between entering something and exiting something and like pulling up a menu or talking to someone and all that kind of stuff. And hearing you describe it, it's very modular sounding. And I was going to ask
Mhm.
you if you had started to incorporate that into your music. It sounds like the answer is yes, but have you ever went to the extent of I mean, is there a way to craft concert music that exactly emulates the modularity of game music?
Yeah, I was really interested in Stravinsky in The Rite of Spring, looking at analysis of his music that sort of broke it down into different loops almost. So at one point, I was really interested in like fractal systems. making systems that were self similar at the macro and micro scale. And I had a piece called Inculcate performed by my friend Daniel Spearman. And this piece is actually a solo trumpet piece that is constructed of all of these self similar groups of music. And then I shuffle them around. So maybe you had A2, A3, B, B2, B3. And these are all different, maybe containers of music that you then shuffled around, but the way you've shuffled them is self similar too, because it's, the fractal design. So you have this almost randomized string construction of musical containers that you can then have endless variety out of. And I experimented with this for a long time. I did it in a solo setting, then I did it with Agni Suono in a duo setting, where what if each saxophonist had arrhythmic loops? So they have a self-similar set of arrhythmic loops that are similar to each other as well, but that can be overlaid with each other at will.
Yeah.
And that created this really cool textural combination. And then my master's thesis ended up being on Morton Feldman, and that sort of actually broke away from my very structured fractal designs more into maybe what Morton Feldman is more known for, these sort of these canvases of music and these systems of music that are like not quite as, containers of music based. And so that really is kind of like game music. I'd say most game composers maybe aren't that rigidly planning out their music, but you don't have to look far to find examples of, okay, we have intro A, intro B, intro C, stinger 1, stinger 2, and all these sections and whatnot. So very, very connected in a way.
Yeah, it's real cool stuff. Again, this has been endlessly fascinating for me because it's so different from the world that I typically operate in. So it's really cool. So, kind of getting into my final questions, what do you think you would be doing if it wasn't music, if it wasn't making your art?
I mentioned the chemical engineering thing. I would never be a chemical engineer, I think. But as I've sort of, being a freelance composer is really like your own business. And doing all this systematic music and stuff has made me like kind of like interested in designing systems or things that work. And that has made me sort of think of myself like, well, more of an entrepreneurial sense. Like maybe I could design a company that is like sort of like built out something that interests me. I've also found that I've had a bit of a talent for the technical side of things. I'm working quite a bit in proprietary custom game engines and whatnot. And that's sort of made me think that maybe in a different life I could have went like the software engineering route or something like that. But at the same time, I have so much respect for the people I work with who do that, that I know there's miles between us as far as the skill difference. And yeah, I think maybe in that kind of STEM area, maybe more computer based or in the entrepreneurial side. I think, even to this day, there might come a point where I try to make my own company and whatnot to do some I don't know. I have to figure that out first, but I think the variety.
Yeah, that's like the ultimate form of agency, right? Being able to run your own thing and then even employ people. I mean, that's what I'm chasing after
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. So I totally get it.
Yeah, I mean the agency part's interesting too because now I think the game composers and I guess any composers with the most success are those that connect directly with fans. And so I think of the game music a lot in that sense of like there's a lot of composers who work in the AAA space and work on big, big games, but there's a difference between, composers who have huge fan bases and then maybe industry veterans. And I try to think of like, well, at the end of the day, I should try and really connect with the people who want to support my music directly. And maybe that means one day I don't need to be working on games unless I want to and things like that. And I don't need to I guess like classical music is very much attached to a lot of like structures and whatnot. We're seeing more DIY and stuff, and I have a lot of respect for all that for those same reasons.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from?
I'm gonna say it, Reaper. I know Reaper has a lot of fans, but I'll present a new perspective outside of the technical one. When I was 14 years old, I was able to download Reaper for free on its evaluations license and use it for, I'd say, almost a decade before I really got my commercial license. And that meant that almost like I'd say 70% of my career and actually like experience making music, I was able to demo and use Reaper and produce music and grow because it was free and very lightweight. I could install it on my notebook, which couldn't even run Minecraft at 20 frames per second. And yeah, I think Reaper has been very firm on keeping that true. And it's helped me a lot in my courses too, because now I can know that my students can use Reaper on whatever device they have. If they need to, they can put it on a flash drive and bring it wherever they want. And of course, it has become a super deep part of my workflow. Reaper's actually kind of bad for like straight up composing as far as its MIDI tools, but just the sort of flexibility of the software and how deep you could customize it and how accessible it is, I think puts it as like the most impactful thing lifetime. Whereas comparison, I used Sibelius around the same time I got into Reaper, and Sibelius has gone down very tough, I'd say, anti-consumer practices with
Yeah,
its
yeah, yeah.
subscription model being so expensive and stuff. And I think, that's like a big difference.
And just to clarify for those who may not know, Reaper is a DAW, a digital audio workstation.
Yeah. Yeah. Using it for making music, making sounds, and, you know, you could even use it for a podcast like this.
Yeah, yeah. So my final question for you is as broad as you want it to be. And that is, what is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
That's an interesting one. Well, I'll say today happens to be my 10-year anniversary with my partner Han Hitchin, and it makes me think a lot about the invisible helpers along the way. Music in general thrives through people supporting each other. And I think in a lot of ways I'm like such an outlier case of someone who has broken into like the game industry and stuff. But a lot of the stuff I mentioned, whether it be in high school, the opportunities I had being able to play in band or working with Ryan Stunkel from Blipsounds or getting a ton of support from Han and my family, even making this possible, that has gone a long way. And one of the lessons I just have continually learned being in the game industry and making classical music is that you have to be a very giving person. You should look out for those around you and collaborate freely. When I was making no money, I was helping people just as much as I was when I was making way more money than the people around me. And I tried to just never forget that this stuff wouldn't be possible without each other.
Yeah.
Even us being on this podcast together started in like 2017.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't have happened if you weren't such an open person, to connect with someone who's very new to the world of music. And yeah, I'd say maybe that's just like something about my art. It just literally wouldn't happen without people's support. And that's just goes beyond financial. The money part I think is something everyone's trying to circumvent, but it's really the community aspect that seems to make this stuff even feasible.
Yeah. And I mean, really, at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. We're all people, and I would rather reach back and do what I can to help others than pull the ladder up behind myself, so to speak. And that's what you're saying. I think everyone who has made a difference in both of our lives, and that's in a lot of cases the same people,
Mhm.
um, you know, they've been very giving about their time and resources and knowledge. So I love that.
Maybe it's one of the most positive things about music. It does bring people together, you know? And I don't know, people say they say music is a universal language. I try to say, I mean, all the musical historical issues aside, maybe music just helps us all, connect,
Yeah,
and I think there is some truth to that statement. And yeah, it's just something I always try to remind myself. I never try to leave people behind, or I guess even leave myself behind, in pursuit of a career.
yeah, yeah. I really appreciate that, Josh. This has been one of my favorite conversations, just based on the amount of stuff that I've learned from you, and just really want to thank you and express my gratitude for your time today.
Oh, I had a great time, and it'd be amazing if you could interview yourself. There's so much interesting stuff you said in here about your music, and I hope people don't forget that who are tuning in. Tyler's really amazing.
Well, I thank you. It's not about me, but I appreciate the sentiment.
Yeah, I had a great time.
So I'm going to be completely honest with you. This conversation with Josh was perhaps the most I've learned about anything related to music composition in a very, very long time. I loved every second of it, and I'm just really excited that I got to speak with him and share all of that with you. Joshua Mallard is online at joshuamallard.com, where he's got lots of music for you to listen to, some really great game music samples like we discussed today, his concert music, the whole nine yards. Really hope you'll dig into that. Again, joshuamallard.com. I'm Tyler Kline, and thanks so much for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. Music Maker with Tyler Kline is a production of Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. We're online at looseleaftransmissions.com, and while you're on our website, you can find more episodes of the podcast, as well as ways to support us. And that'll do it. That's all I've got for this episode of Music Maker. Do take care, and I will see you here next time.